I sat on the cushioned armchair in the hotel room Marielle had rented after running off inexplicably from her shift last night. I called her earlier this morning after finishing work without even going to sleep. She's always been level-headed, and her acting like this made me feel concerned. I couldn't just let it go. And now here I was, listening to how she apparently spoke to herself last night on the phone. Marielle, are you sure these night shifts aren't a bit too much for you? Though I wanted to trust her, what she was describing to me sounded straight out of a book or a movie, and the lack of sleep really takes a toll too big for you to even comprehend. I'm not saying you're making this up, but maybe just you remember it wrong? Marielle paced around the room with one hand resting on her hip and the other held up to her forehead, pushing her hair back and exhaled loudly. I know how insane this sounds, Connor, but I'm telling you, I'm 100% certain about what I heard and saw on those cameras. There was another me in that house last night, and some person broke my damn window. How can you be taking this so calmly? We haven't even heard from the responders yet, and it's been more than 6 hours. She was right. There had been no info back to us on that call, nothing on the news, no contact from the officers. When I used Marielle's phone to try and call back whoever it was that woke her up, there was nothing. I told her that while I can't explain the call itself, I agreed that it was too dangerous for her to go back home, considering there was an intruder. I offered her to stay at my place for the next few days, and while she agreed and thanked me, she wouldn't let the topic of her other self go. I understood her to some extent, but I was still skeptical. So I offered her to go back to my place so I can change and grab the pistol I kept locked in my safe, and a flashlight. Then we could look for the officers at her house ourselves. She was afraid, but I think the curiosity and stress about what might have happened to the supposed other her prevailed, and was what made her agree to this plan. I waited for her to get her things out of the room, and I drove back to my house, in the meantime asking her about any details she might have missed about the call, to make sure we were going in prepared. The drive to her house was not long, and during it I tried to play some music to lighten the mood or to talk to her about anything so I could distract her. But all I got was 1 or 2 words in response while she was lost in thought, looking out the window. When we arrived, I parked in her driveway where just outside sat the policeman's car, with the 2 front doors slightly ajar but no sign of them. Marielle's breathing fastened and I put a hand on her shoulder to calm her down. Then without anything being said, both of us got out of the car. The first thing we did was walk up to the police car and see if there was anything out of the ordinary, like slashed tires or any signs of a struggle. But it was parked there like any other vehicle, and there was nothing obvious on the inside. What I discovered, though, was the radio, which, while it didn't look like it had been tampered with, was not working. I walked back towards the house and called for Marielle to walk with me as we circled it from afar, finding the broken window leading into the kitchen. I was just about to suggest calling 911 again and have them go into the house while we wait outside, but Marielle snapped before I could even speak. Why the hell is nothing being done about this? She raised her hands in the air and turned to look at me, her blue eyes conveying a mixture of anger and confusion. 2 policemen have disappeared since responding to this call. There was an intruder in my home, and there was literally a clone or something of me inside while I was at work. Tell me why we haven't heard anything about this, Connor. I don't know, okay? If everything happened like you say it did, it just doesn't make sense. I cut her off before she started talking again, knowing that she'd jump me for accusing her of lying. But we really should just let the authorities handle this. We're not professionals. Marielle tried to get something out, but just cut herself off and shook her head. I thought she had given in and would do the logical thing and take my advice. Instead, she turned and walked a few steps toward her back door, and then looked back at me. What are you doing? I'm going in. No one's going to listen to me anyway, and I'm not about to leave here without at least some kind of answer or clue. I stared at her, completely taken aback, and waited a few seconds to see if she would say anything else, but she just stayed there looking right at me. I knew deep down she was hoping I would say that I'm going in with her. Well, before I did that, I tried to convince her to think this through again, but that was obviously not going to work. So, that's just what I did. But I have to admit, I was getting nervous myself. The back door was unlocked and led into a different hallway than the one she told me about, which I figured out by the lack of an attic hatch. Mariel told me the layout of her home and we walked together, me in the front and with my gun drawn as I called out asking if anyone was there. She smacked my shoulder and raised her arms with wide eyes, and I shushed her. We had no way of knowing if there was an intruder or police officers or both, and I didn't want blood on my hands, no matter whose. As you might expect, we got no response from anywhere, and heard nothing that might indicate there being anyone else here with us. We found nothing out of the ordinary in the rooms of Mariel's home, but the hallway with the attic had some things worth noting, the first being what we immediately saw. The phone on the ground, and the slight marks like scratches on the walls, which were the only signs of anything out of the ordinary. Well, besides the broken window. That must be what she used to call. It's identical to mine. She grabbed it and tried turning it on, but it had no battery left. The screen was slightly cracked at the top right edge, probably where it first impacted the floor. What the hell is going on, Connor? Calm down, I began, knowing that she wouldn't listen. There's only the attic and the basement left for us to look through. You can check up there and then go down last. How's that sound? Yeah, okay, but the basement's locked. If the key hasn't been moved, it must be in one of my bedroom drawers. All right, I'll check out the attic while you grab the key. There's no point in both of us going up there. I raised the gun in the air while reaching for my flashlight. Don't worry about me. Mariel nodded and began walking towards the bedroom, disappearing past the door after I started ascending into the attic. There was nothing on top of the hatch, which I realized before even looking around to see because of how easily I was able to lift it open, confirming our suspicions that the other woman hadn't made it up there before the end of the call. What immediately struck me as odd was the immediate drop in temperature here. Yeah, it was the attic, but the difference must have been at least 10 degrees, and I shivered as I made my way up and started shining the light across the entire space, behind empty old boxes, worn-out furniture, and the various other items not worth noting. There was no place for anyone to hide up here, or at least not if you ask me, because I looked through every nook and cranny there was, and found no traces of anyone or anything. Walking back, I started descending the ladder and called for Mariel but got no response. I wasn't immediately concerned because the hatch was left open, and if anything had happened, I'd have heard. Waiting for a few seconds and remaining without a response, I made my way towards the bedroom, which was just as empty as when we looked in there together earlier. I called for her again and started looking through each of the rooms, and while doing that I paused for a moment to listen, but not for Mariel. The background noises from earlier, like birds or passing cars, had all stopped. Again, that didn't strike me as odd at that moment. Looking through the rest of the rooms proved fruitless, and I thought that maybe she had gone outside, probably waiting for me by the basement. And so I made my way to the back door and opened it. It led me back into the living room. I blinked and looked behind me. I was certainly in the same corridor we were first in when entering the house. Despite that, I shut the door and turned back to exit from the front of the house, and when I opened that one, I was greeted with the kitchen. I just stood there for a few seconds, unable to take in what was happening, and rub my eyes. But here I was, still inside the house, standing right at the front door, which was leading me back inside. I walked through and approached the window that was broken by the intruder. Instead of the green yard, the street with parked cars and neighboring houses, I was greeted by a view into the bedroom. My heart started pounding, and I admit that I was on the verge of a panic attack. I started sweating profusely, and my heart felt like it was about to jump out of my chest as I began running from room to room, door through door, trying to get out, and again finding myself in different parts of the house. I had to stop and sit down a few moments before I passed out, and while regaining my composure, I saw something odd. Not that this whole situation wasn't far more disturbing than I am giving it credit for. I noticed that the walls of the living room where I was currently sitting had changed color, and half the table was just missing. Imagine a bug or a glitch in some video game where half a piece of furniture is there and the rest is gone. The table still had two of its legs, on which it was standing completely fine, but the surface was cut diagonally, and the rest of it just wasn't even there. I waved my hand through where it was supposed to be, and they just swiped right through the air. I continued walking through different rooms, and the changes began getting more and more apparent, like the chandelier in the kitchen was upside down and sitting in the middle of the air, attached to nothing. It was physically there, and when I tried pushing it, it wouldn't move, but I could feel and touch it. I don't know how long I spent in this place, but for the first time in what was now feeling like hours, I heard a noise. Breathing. Rapid, scared breathing just like mine when I found myself here. It was coming from the neighboring room. I couldn't say which one, as by now it'd been a gamble where I'd stumble at. I ended up appearing back into the bedroom, where I was greeted by a gruesome sight of a tall man with torn clothing and wounds, superficial and deep all over his body, lying in a messy pool of blood, and something dark mixed with it, some of which was also splattered on the wall behind him, where I saw the same scratch marks as the ones on the walls of the hallway earlier. It was as if I had an instantaneous flashback after seeing him. What remained of his clothing was the same as what the person who broke into Marielle's home was wearing. He was still alive, but his eyes were red and he screamed as he saw me. I did the same in reaction. "No, no, no! Get away! Get away from me!" He yelled through pained inhales and tried to muster up strength to throw one of his shoes at me, but it only got over his leg and was barely any further away from him. "Get the fuck away! I'm not going to hurt you. Look, you're not real. Not real." Taking the risk of giving him a heart attack that would finally take him out of his misery, I rushed by his side and held my hands in the air, yelling loud enough to silence him. I started shooting every question I could think of at him, and when he stopped trying to talk over me, I grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him. He looked as if he was about to faint any moment now. I asked him what this place was, why he broke in, if he knows Marielle, and I could barely get any coherent response out of him until he grasped my right arm with strength he didn't look like he had, which left me shocked and silent. During the time of my silence, he spoke. "Not people. Fake." Before I could inquire or he could reveal more himself, I was suddenly thrown into the wall, next to the man. I couldn't even yell in reaction to the pain. Another blow struck me right in the ribs, and the pain was so unexpected and strong I held my eyes shut and clutched at my sides. Amidst the chaos, I could hear the man scream, and suddenly what I assumed happened was that he got thrown away. His screams continued but faded in the distance, and I heard a crash and a glass breaking. Mere moments later, just as I was about to open my eyes, I was grabbed by one of my arms and flung right back out the room's door. Suddenly, all the noise stopped, and I stayed curled in a ball on the floor, tears of pain streaming down my cheeks as I held my hands over where I'd been kicked, or punched, or whatever happened. I assumed I had at least 2 broken ribs, and I could barely touch the area without sharp pain coming in. When I opened my eyes, I found myself back in the attic, but this time I could hear Marielle yelling for me downstairs. I slowly got myself back up, holding my side while descending back down into the corridor. I could hear the neighborhood sounds had returned. "I'm here!" I shouted and sat on the floor while waiting for her to arrive. When she did, she gasped and ran at me, putting a hand on my shoulder, asking me what happened and how I got hurt. "We have to get out of here." She helped me get up, allowing me to lean on her as we started walking out. "I'll explain at the hotel." I allowed her to drive and she kept asking me questions in the meantime, but I was too exhausted and in pain to respond coherently. We arrived at the parking lot and she turned to face me, looking me in the eyes and saying something I did not even register at that point. I was too caught up in a small detail that I knew I would have noticed for all the time I've known her. "Marielle, since when are your eyes 2 different colors?"